Is metformin optimal for health? In this video, we'll have a look at data from 3 studies that suggest that maybe metformin is not optimal for health. In the first, we'll see that metformin induces muscle atrophy in mice, and then in 2 randomized controlled trials in older adults, we'll see that metformin blunts muscle hypertrophy in response to progressive resistance exercise training, and in the second, we'll see that metformin affects insulin sensitivity and potentially VO2 max in older adults that underwent aerobic exercise training for 12 weeks. So when considering these data in terms of skeletal muscle and exercise training related health and functional improvements, metformin may not be optimal for health. So first, let's take a look at the data in cells. So in there, we'll see that metformin increases myostatin gene expression and myostatin protein levels. So the obvious question should be, why is myostatin important? So here we're looking at muscle mass in normal mice, the upper arm in the left picture and the lower leg in the right picture. So what happens when you knock out myostatin? So you delete the gene for myostatin and then the animals don't have detectable levels of myostatin. So here we can see dramatically increased muscle mass. So when the animals don't have myostatin, there is dramatically increased muscle mass in the both upper arm, as you can see on the left bottom panel, and in the leg in the right corner. So does metformin affect levels of myostatin? And as I mentioned, I'm going to start with the data in cells, we'll go over to mice, and then we'll go into the human data. So here we're looking at relative myostatin gene expression. So this is mRNA expression for myostatin in the presence or absence of metformin. So the absence of metformin with the minus sign, and in the presence of metformin with the plus sign. And again, these are in C2, C12 muscle cells. This is an in vitro assay that's performed outside of the body in muscle cells. So in the presence of metformin, we can see dramatically increased myostatin expression, myostatin gene expression, almost 150-fold. So although gene expression is important, that doesn't mean that the gene is going to be translated into protein. So to assess that, the authors of this study then looked at myostatin protein levels in these muscle cells. And as you can see, as the metformin levels were increased up to 2 millimolar, myostatin protein levels correspondingly increased. So these data suggest that metformin may be bad for muscle, in part by increasing levels of myostatin. Now note that these data are in muscle cells. What about metformin's effects in mice? So to test that, the authors of that same study then supplemented 7-week-old male C57 black 6J mice. So note that a 7-week-old mouse is the equivalent of about a 5-year-old in human years when considering about a 40-month maximum lifespan. So these 7-week-old mice, these very young mice, were injected with metformin or saline as controls 3 times a week for 4 weeks. So what was the effect of metformin treatment on myostatin? So that's what we can see here. Again, we're looking at myostatin gene expression on the y-axis in controls and in the metformin-treated mice. And what we can see is that metformin treatment significantly increased myostatin expression, about a 50% increase for myostatin gene expression in the animals that were supplemented with metformin. So then the big question is, did metformin treatment affect muscle mass in these mice? So to assess that, the authors of this study looked at average muscle fiber cross-sectional area, so CSA, when comparing the controls with the metformin supplemented mice. And as we can see, there was significantly smaller muscle cross-sectional area in the metformin-treated mice. So what about effects on muscle function? So did metformin treatment affect muscle strength? So to assess that, they looked at grip strength. And remember, this was a 4-week study. So at the end of the 4-week study, whether being supplemented with metformin or injected with metformin or saline as a control, we can see that the metformin injected mice, or mice that were injected with metformin, had significantly reduced grip strength at the end of the 4-week study, so the dashed lines, when compared with the saline injected animals with the solid lines. So from this we can conclude there's reduced not only muscle cross-sectional area, but also reduced muscle strength in the metformin treated mice. So to sum these data up in the mice, metformin induces myostatin gene expression, decreases muscle cross-sectional area, and reduces grip strength in young mice. So then the next question should obviously be, does metformin impact muscle-related measures in people? So this is the first randomized controlled trial of metformin supplementation in older adults. And in this study, the metformin dose was 1,700 milligrams per day. And just to define the subject population a little bit more, these were overweight. So the average BMI for both groups, the controls and the metformin supplemented group, was greater than 25 kilograms per meter squared. And then in terms of their age, they average age was 69, and there were 94 total subjects in the study, and these older adults were at risk for mobility disability. So first, when looking at the change in lean mass as a result of the 14-week strength training program, we can see that the placebo had significant increases for whole body lean mass, whereas the metformin group increased less, and the difference between the improvement in whole body lean mass was greater for the placebo group when compared with the metformin supplemented group, as you can see by the statistically significant p-value of 0.03. Now note that this lean mass was measured with DEXA. So DEXA measured lean mass doesn't only include muscle mass, but it also includes the organ masses. So to account for that, the authors of this study also looked at thigh muscle mass. And as we can see there, placebo supplemented older adults had a far greater improvement for thigh muscle mass, or the percentage of thigh muscle mass, when compared with metformin supplemented older adults. And again, these two groups of data are statistically significant. So a greater increase for thigh muscle mass percentage in the placebo treated when compared with the metformin treated. So what about metformin supplementation and how it affects muscle function? And that's what we can see here. So we're looking at three relatively similar measures of strength testing. And to assess strength, they looked at knee extension. So I should say they measured it with three various measures of knee extension. So in the first, it was the knee extension 1 repetition maximum, 1 RM. And then they looked at the maximum voluntary isometric contraction for a knee extension. And then they looked at knee extension power. And then we're comparing the placebo group on the left, so their baseline data, 14 weeks after the progressive resistance training program, and then the percent change for the placebo group when compared with the metformin group. So you've got the baseline, 14 weeks after baseline, and then the percent change. So first, when looking at the knee extension 1 rep max, we can see that the metformin group improved about 8% less than the placebo group. And this data was very close to statistical significance, where a statistical significant p-value of less than 0.05, that's statistically significant. So this is very close, 0.055. So similar data was also identified for the maximum voluntary isometric contraction, where the metformin group improved about 5% less than the placebo group. And then also that data also is close to statistical significance with a p-value of 0.08. And then last but not least, in terms of knee extension power, the metformin group improved about half as much as the placebo-treated group. And again, that data was also very close to statistical significance, 0.064. So from this, we can conclude that there were trends for less muscle strength and power improvements in the metformin-treated older adults that underwent progressive resistance exercise training when compared with placebo. Now, as a caveat to this data, note the superscripts there, the little b's for each of those three measures. And what that indicates is that for baseline levels of these strength and power measurements in the metformin-treated group, they were statistically significantly higher than the baseline values for these three measures in the placebo group, which then raises the question, were these strength and power measures, did they improve less in the metformin-treated group because they started at a higher strength and power baseline data? So it's harder to improve if you're already at a relatively higher strength and power level when compared with the placebo group. So that question gets raised with these data. All right, so metformin is well known to reduce circulating levels of glucose. So did metformin improve glucose levels and or insulin sensitivity in combination with this strength training program? So that's what we're looking at here, plus data for placebo on the left and for metformin on the right. And we've got data for fasting glucose on the top and an insulin sensitivity index on the bottom. So this is an oral glucose tolerance test, OGTT. Participants were given 75 grams of sugar, a sugar solution, and then the blood levels of glucose and insulin were then measured at defined time periods after consumption of the sugar solution, and the insulin sensitivity index was calculated based on that data. So first, when both groups improved their fasting glucose levels as a result of the strength training program. But note that the metformin-treated group did not have a further improved fasting glucose level when compared with placebo. Similarly, the insulin sensitivity index improved in both groups, so placebo and metformin-treated. But again, the metformin-treated group did not have a further improvement in insulin sensitivity when compared with placebo. So from this, we can conclude that glucose and insulin sensitivity were not further improved for the group that was supplemented with metformin and that underwent this strength training program when compared with placebo. So in the last paper, in the second randomized controlled trial, which included obese subjects, so the average BMI of the subjects in this study was greater than 30 kilograms per meter squared. These were older adults that were between 62 and 63 years old with a relatively smaller sample size, 53 subjects, and these people underwent 12 weeks of aerobic exercise training. Now, in terms of how much metformin they were taking, a ramp protocol was used. 500 milligrams per day during week 1, 1,000 in week 2, 1,500 milligrams per day in week 3, and 2,000 milligrams in week 4 that continued until the 12-week study was concluded. Now, for people that weighed less than 75 kilograms, they were ramped to 1,500 milligrams of metformin a day, and then they stayed there at that dose for the remainder of the 12-week study. So first, in terms of improvements for whole body insulin sensitivity as a result of the 12-week aerobic exercise training program, we can see that people in the placebo group improved their whole body insulin sensitivity significantly more than the metformin treated group. So this data suggests that metformin impairs aerobic exercise induced improvements for insulin sensitivity. And then in similar data to the physical function data of the last study, when looking at VO2 max here on the y-axis for the placebo treated versus the metformin treated older adults, we can see a close to statistically significant trend for the metformin group improving their VO2 max less as a result of the aerobic exercise training when compared with the placebo treated. So that p-value is very close, it's 0.08. So again, a trend for a lesser VO2 max improvement in the metformin supplemented subjects, which kind of agrees with the data from the last study, with very close to statistical significant decreases for strength and power gains in the metformin treated group. Only in this study, it's lesser improvements for VO2 max. So at best, when considering these two studies, these two randomized controlled trials of metformin supplementation in older adults, at best, metformin does not further improve insulin sensitivity or physical function in exercise-trained older adults. But at worst, metformin impairs insulin sensitivity, reduces muscle mass and physical function gains in exercise-trained older adults. All right, that's all for now. If you're interested in more about my attempts to biohack aging, come check us out and maybe even join us on Patreon. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Have a great day.